Money did not begin as metal, paper, or numbers. It began as an agreement so subtle that most societies never recognized it as such. An unspoken pact between strangers, sustained not by force, but by belief. A shared conviction that effort today would translate into security tomorrow. That exchange would remain fair enough to justify cooperation. That the future, though uncertain, would still reward participation. This invisible agreement was humanity's greatest economic invention. Before money, survival depended on immediacy. Food had to be consumed quickly. Goods lost value if they could not be exchanged at once. Trust rarely extended beyond kinship or proximity. Communities remained small because complexity required something more durable than memory. Money solved this problem not by storing wealth, but by storing trust. It allowed time itself to enter the economy. Labor could be performed now and rewarded later. Value could move across distance. Obligation could be delayed. Planning became possible. Specialization emerged. Cities formed. Civilization accelerated. But money was never neutral. From its earliest forms, money shaped behavior, hierarchy, obedience, and fear. It decided who could wait and who could not, who could accumulate and who would remain exposed, who could survive a bad season and who would be erased by it. Most importantly, money worked only as long as people believed the agreement was intact. History often treats money as a technical evolution. Shells replaced by metal, metal by paper, paper by numbers. But this view misses the essential truth. Money is not sustained by its material form. It is sustained by confidence. Confidence that tomorrow's value will resemble today's closely enough to justify effort. When that confidence exists, societies endure extraordinary inequality, hardship, and delay. People work long hours. They accept imbalance. They tolerate injustice. They comply. Because they believe the system will eventually compensate them. This belief is the quiet engine of every economy that has ever functioned. Ancient civilizations understood this instinctively, even if they lacked the language to describe it. In Mesopotamia, some of the earliest written records humanity possesses are not myths or poetry, but economic ledgers. Clay tablets meticulously recorded wages, debts, rents, and obligations. These were complex systems, administered by temples and palaces, deeply embedded in everyday life. But those same records reveal something else. Debt accumulated faster than human endurance. Small farmers fell behind after poor harvests. Families lost land. Obligations compounded. Over time, entire segments of society became trapped, unable to repay, unable to reset, unable to imagine a future beyond survival. This was not merely an economic problem, it was a social threat. When too many people lose faith in the fairness of the system, stability collapses, not immediately, but inevitably. Ancient rulers recognized this danger with unsettling clarity. Their response was not reform in the modern sense. It was erasure. Debt jubilees were declared. Records were destroyed. Obligations were wiped clean by decree. These acts were not moral gestures. They were survival mechanisms. Without them, the economy would have devoured the society that sustained it. This reveals a critical truth. From its very origin, money carried instability within it. It could organize society, but it could also strangle it. It could reward productivity, but it could also punish survival. It could concentrate power faster than any political system could restrain it. As long as people believed the system would correct itself, they endured its contradictions. But belief has limits. History shows that when money stops protecting effort, when work no longer guarantees security, when saving no longer preserves dignity, when obedience no longer ensures stability, the invisible agreement begins to fracture. This fracture is rarely visible at first. People adapt. They adjust expectations downward. They accept smaller returns for the same labor. They postpone dreams. They tell themselves the hardship is temporary. They continue to participate. This is the most dangerous phase of any economic collapse. Because money still circulates, markets still function, authority remains intact. From the outside, the system appears alive. But internally, trust is draining away. Prices rise, wages lag, promises stretch thin. Planning becomes short-term. Risk tolerance vanishes. People stop investing in the future and start protecting the present. This shift is not announced. It spreads quietly, through hesitation, through altered behavior, through silence. Historical narratives often focus on the dramatic end: hyperinflation, market collapse, revolution, social unrest. But by the time these events occur, the economy has already died. The true collapse happens earlier. It happens when people realize that money no longer represents a fair future. At that moment, the agreement breaks, not violently, not suddenly, but decisively. Once belief withdraws, money becomes an object without authority. Coins still exist, numbers still circulate, but meaning is gone. No decree can restore it easily. No reform can command it instantly. Trust, once broken, does not respond to force. Throughout history, civilizations have faced this moment. Some recognized it and intervened. Some ignored it until confidence evaporated. Some misdiagnosed the problem entirely, believing their crisis was technical rather than psychological. They thought their economy was failing. In truth, their belief system was collapsing. Because money does not survive on metal, paper, or law, it survives on faith. And when faith erodes, even the most powerful economies unravel, not with noise, but with silence. This chapter marks the beginning of that unraveling. In the chapters that follow, we will trace what happens when trust collapses, when systems attempt to preserve themselves through manipulation, and when societies confront a truth they would rather avoid. That money does not fail when it disappears. It fails when people stop believing it speaks for them. When belief in money begins to weaken, societies rarely acknowledge it openly. Instead, they manage it. History shows that economic collapse almost never begins with chaos. It begins with control, with subtle adjustments designed to preserve the appearance of stability while the foundations quietly erode. At this stage, authorities do not admit failure. They cannot. To do so would accelerate the loss of confidence they are trying to prevent. So they intervene carefully, incrementally, and always with the same justification: necessity. Currencies are adjusted, weights are altered, standards are redefined. What once represented a fixed measure of value becomes flexible, then negotiable, then uncertain. This process is ancient. In the Roman world, silver coins were gradually debased. Precious metal was shaved, diluted, or replaced with cheaper alloys. The face value remained. The trust behind it weakened. Citizens continued to accept the currency, not because it held the same worth, but because refusing it meant exclusion from economic life. This is how manipulation succeeds, not through force, but through dependence. People rarely abandon a system immediately after it betrays them. They adapt, they rationalize, they hope conditions will normalize. They tell themselves the changes are temporary. Meanwhile, the system buys time. Debasement does not announce itself as theft. It presents itself as policy. Inflation is not described as loss, but as adjustment. Scarcity is reframed as transition. Each measure appears small enough to tolerate, reasonable enough to accept, but collectively, they alter the meaning of money itself. Money ceases to be a reliable store of effort. What was earned yesterday buys less tomorrow. Savings no longer protect the future. Long-term planning becomes irrational. The economy shifts from growth to survival. This is not yet collapse. This is betrayal. The betrayal lies not only in the manipulation of currency, but in the silence that surrounds it. Systems depend on complexity to obscure responsibility. When value erodes, no single actor appears accountable. Blame dissolves into abstraction. Markets, circumstances, external pressures. History shows this pattern repeatedly. When economic pain spreads, those with power protect structure, not people. They preserve institutions first, believing society can absorb the cost. But society is not infinite. Its tolerance is psychological. At this stage, inequality deepens rapidly. Those closest to authority adapt faster. They move assets, secure exemptions, shift burdens downward. Those farthest from power experience instability as personal failure rather than systemic design. This misinterpretation is critical. When individuals believe they are failing alone, collective resistance dissolves. Shame replaces anger. Silence replaces coordination. The system survives longer precisely because its victims internalize the collapse. Ancient economies reveal this dynamic with unsettling clarity. As currencies weakened, wages lagged. As obligations increased, protections vanished. People worked harder for diminishing security, convinced endurance would be rewarded. It rarely was. History records moments when societies reached a breaking point, not because conditions were unbearable, but because trust finally dissolved. When people realized the system was no longer correcting itself, when manipulation replaced stewardship, at that moment behavior changed. People withdrew from official economies. They hoarded goods instead of currency. They favored barter, favors, and local exchange. They trusted relationships more than institutions. This shift marks a profound transformation. Money still exists. Markets still operate. Authority remains intact. But participation becomes selective. People comply outwardly while disengaging inwardly. This dual reality is dangerous. It creates an economy that functions on the surface and decays underneath. Productivity declines. Innovation stalls. Social cohesion fractures. The system survives in form, but not in spirit. Historical accounts often misinterpret this phase as resilience. It is not. It is the final endurance of belief before collapse. Because once trust is broken, it does not regenerate easily. No reform can restore credibility if people believe manipulation is permanent. Stability cannot be commanded. It must be earned. Some civilizations recognized this and attempted radical correction. Others doubled down on control. They imposed price ceilings, mandated acceptance of debased currency, punished refusal. These measures extended order briefly and destroyed it permanently. Force can enforce compliance. It cannot enforce belief. This is the paradox at the heart of every failing economy. The more aggressively a system tries to preserve itself through manipulation, the more clearly it signals that trust has already been lost. By the time people openly reject money, the collapse is complete. But long before that moment arrives, something else disappears first: faith. Not faith in markets or numbers, but faith in fairness. Faith that effort and reward remain connected. Faith that the future is still negotiable. This is the slow betrayal, and it sets the stage for what follows. Not economic failure alone, but social unraveling. In the next chapter, we will see what happens when societies attempt to survive this betrayal by redefining value itself, and why that attempt often accelerates the end rather than prevents it. When money begins to lose its meaning, societies do not collapse immediately. They adapt. This adaptation is often misunderstood as resilience, ingenuity, or flexibility. In reality, it is something far more complex and far more dangerous: a collective redefinition of value itself. Not through ideology or philosophy, but through behavior. Through quiet decisions made by millions of individuals who no longer trust abstraction to protect their survival. Money fails not when it disappears, but when it stops answering the most basic human question: Will this still matter tomorrow? When the answer becomes uncertain, people search for alternatives. History shows that during prolonged economic instability, value migrates away from symbols and toward necessities. Coin yields to grain, credit yields to land, wages yield to food, shelter, and protection. This shift does not occur because people reject money intellectually, but because they no longer experience it as reliable. In ancient societies, this transformation is visible in administrative records, long before it appears in political narratives. Temples and palaces begin compensating labor, not in currency, but in rations. Soldiers demand supplies instead of pay. Taxes are collected in produce rather than coin. Contracts remain written in monetary terms, but daily life operates on tangible exchange. This is not innovation. It is retreat. The economy does not evolve forward. It contracts inward. Money once allowed value to move across time and distance. It enabled planning, specialization, and trust between strangers. When money loses credibility, those functions collapse. Exchange becomes local, trust becomes personal. Obligation becomes immediate, the future shrinks. People stop saving, not because they are irresponsible, but because saving no longer makes sense. They stop investing in long-term projects because risk becomes intolerable. They stop trusting institutions because institutions no longer shield them from uncertainty. What replaces money is not a better system, but a narrower one. Barter, favors, and informal exchange networks emerge not as progress, but as necessity. Relationships replace contracts. Reputation replaces credit. Survival replaces growth. From the outside, these societies still appear functional. Markets still exist. Authorities still issue decrees. Currencies still circulate. But beneath the surface, the economy has fragmented into parallel realities. An official economy that persists in form. A real economy that operates in practice. This duality is one of the most reliable indicators of long-term collapse. When value becomes fragmented, power follows. Those who control land, food, storage, or protection gain disproportionate influence. Social mobility declines rapidly. Inequality hardens into structure rather than outcome. Ironically, money, flawed as it was, once allowed movement. Its erosion traps people in place. History reveals that societies undergoing this transition often misinterpret what is happening. Leaders view the rise of informal exchange as disorder rather than symptom. They attempt to reassert control by regulating value instead of restoring trust. They impose price ceilings. They mandate currency acceptance. They criminalize unofficial trade. These measures are framed as stabilization. In reality, they accelerate disengagement. Force can compel compliance. It cannot compel belief. When people are required to accept a currency they no longer trust, they obey outwardly and withdraw inwardly. Economic participation becomes performative. Official systems survive in appearance while meaning drains away. At this stage, economic life becomes psychologically exhausting. Individuals must navigate two realities simultaneously: the rules they are required to follow and the strategies they need to survive. This constant tension erodes social cohesion and increases fear. Fear changes behavior. When fear dominates decision-making, cooperation declines. Risk-taking disappears. Innovation halts. Knowledge stagnates, not because it is lost, but because it is no longer applied. Society enters a state of suspended endurance. From a historical perspective, this phase can last generations. It is often remembered later as decline, stagnation, or decay. But for those living through it, it feels like permanence. This is why redefining value rarely saves civilizations. It allows them to endure longer, but at a cost. Each adaptation sacrifices complexity, trust, and future orientation. What remains is survival without direction. Authorities, observing declining productivity and loyalty, often respond with greater control. They centralize resources, they restrict movement, they increase enforcement. Each intervention further confirms what people already suspect. The system no longer serves them. At this point, collapse is no longer economic. It is psychological. People stop believing that participation leads to improvement. They stop imagining a future worth investing in. They accept endurance as destiny. This acceptance is fatal because civilizations do not fall when resources vanish. They fall when meaning disappears. When value no longer connects effort to hope, economies cease to function as engines of civilization. They become mechanisms of containment. History shows that once a society reaches this stage, recovery becomes extraordinarily difficult. Rebuilding trust requires more than reform. It requires rupture, a clear break from the past that signals credibility has been restored. Without that break, endurance continues, and endurance, stretched too far, becomes collapse. In the next chapter, we will examine how societies respond when redefining value fails, when control replaces trust entirely, and when the preservation of systems becomes more important than the preservation of people. It is there that economic crisis transforms into social fracture. When redefining value fails, societies turn to control. This transition is rarely announced. It does not arrive with declarations of tyranny or admissions of failure. Instead, it presents itself as order, as protection, as necessity. Control enters the system not as an enemy of stability, but as its last defense. History shows that this moment follows a familiar pattern. Trust erodes, value fragments, participation declines. Faced with this unraveling, authorities conclude that the problem is not belief, but behavior. If people no longer trust the system must compel compliance. If money no longer motivates cooperation, obedience must replace consent. This is the moment when economies stop being negotiated and start being enforced. In ancient civilizations, this shift can be traced through law codes, decrees, and administrative expansion. Price controls are imposed to halt inflation. Wage limits are introduced to restrain unrest. Mandatory acceptance of currency is enforced under threat of punishment. Movement is regulated. Hoarding is criminalized. Exchange is monitored. Each measure is framed as temporary. Each is justified as unavoidable. Together, they mark the end of trust as a governing principle. Control becomes the substitute. But control is not neutral. It reshapes the economy at every level. It alters incentives, behavior, and psychology. When people are no longer participating because they believe in the system, they participate because they fear exclusion or punishment. This distinction matters. An economy built on trust encourages contribution, risk-taking, and long-term planning. An economy built on control encourages compliance, concealment, and short-term survival. Innovation disappears. Transparency collapses. Informal networks replace formal ones. From a distance, order appears restored. Markets reopen. Prices stabilize temporarily. Authority reasserts itself. But beneath this surface, economic life becomes brittle because control cannot replace meaning. Historical records from late Roman, Hellenistic, and other declining systems reveal this brittleness clearly. As a regulation intensified, productivity declined. Small producers abandoned markets they could no longer navigate. Trade routes narrowed. Local economies isolated themselves. Tax collection became increasingly coercive, requiring force where cooperation once sufficed. The system survived, but only by consuming itself. At this stage, fear becomes the dominant economic force. Fear of punishment replaces hope of reward. Fear of loss replaces expectation of growth. People stop asking how to improve their position and start asking how to avoid harm. This shift has profound consequences. When fear governs decision-making, rationality changes. Risk-taking vanishes. Long-term projects are abandoned. Education loses value. Skills atrophy. People do not innovate under threat. They endure. History demonstrates that endurance is not sustainability. The more control expands, the more trust contracts. The system must then exert even greater force to maintain participation. This creates a feedback loop. Declining trust requires increasing control, which further erodes trust. This loop is fatal. Authorities often misinterpret resistance during this phase. They assume unrest is the cause of instability rather than its symptom. Rebellion is treated as disobedience rather than despair. Policy responds with suppression instead of repair. But suppression cannot restore belief. It can only delay its absence. The psychological impact of this phase is often underestimated. Living under enforced economies imposes constant cognitive strain. Individuals must navigate complex rules, anticipate punishment, conceal intent, and manage uncertainty. Over time, this erodes social bonds and collective identity. People stop identifying with the system entirely. They comply outwardly while withdrawing inwardly. Loyalty becomes performative. Participation becomes minimal. The economy continues in appearance but hollows out in substance. This hollowing is visible in historical patterns of hoarding, black markets, and informal exchange. These are not signs of criminality. They are signs of adaptation. People create parallel systems not to undermine authority, but to survive its failure. Ironically, the more aggressively these systems are suppressed, the stronger they become. History shows that when control reaches this intensity, collapse becomes irreversible, not because resources are exhausted, but because legitimacy is. Legitimacy is the final currency of any economy. Once lost, no amount of enforcement can replace it. Some civilizations attempted to escape this fate through radical centralization. They absorbed trade, production, and distribution directly into the state. Others attempted ideological control, redefining loyalty as moral obligation rather than economic participation. These strategies extended order briefly. They destroyed recovery permanently, because recovery requires trust, and trust cannot be commanded. At this point, societies face a final dilemma: continue enforcing a system no one believes in, or allow it to dissolve. Most choose enforcement. Dissolution appears too dangerous, too uncertain, too destabilizing. In choosing control, they guarantee collapse. The economy ceases to function as a means of organizing human effort and becomes a mechanism of containment. Its purpose shifts from enabling life to preventing chaos. Growth is no longer expected. Stability becomes the only goal. But stability without trust is illusion. History shows that once economies reach this stage, they can persist for surprisingly long periods, decades, even centuries. But this persistence is deceptive. It is survival without vitality, order without meaning, continuity without future. The collapse, when it comes, appears sudden only because the erosion was gradual. By the time systems finally fail, belief has been gone for generations. This is the moment when money no longer matters at all, not because it disappears, but because it no longer represents anything people are willing to sacrifice for. In the next chapter, we will examine the final stage of this process, when societies confront the full consequences of enforced economies, and when the absence of trust produces outcomes that no amount of control can prevent. It is there that collapse stops being managed and becomes inevitable. When control replaces trust, societies do not collapse immediately. They endure. This endurance is often mistaken for resilience. From the outside, systems still function. Institutions remain standing. Laws are enforced. Currency circulates. The appearance of order persists long after meaning has vanished. But endurance is not recovery. It is containment. History shows that once an economy reaches this stage, it no longer serves as a framework for cooperation or progress. It becomes a mechanism for delay, postponing consequences that can no longer be avoided. This is the point of no return. At this stage, money has lost its final function. It no longer connects individual effort to collective future. Work is performed not with expectation, but with resignation. Participation continues not because people believe in outcomes, but because withdrawal carries immediate risk. The economy still moves, but it moves without direction. In ancient societies, this phase is marked by profound psychological shifts that rarely appear in traditional historical records. People stop identifying with institutions. Loyalty dissolves into habit. Obedience replaces participation. Survival replaces ambition. Economic behavior becomes defensive. Individuals focus on minimizing exposure rather than maximizing opportunity. They avoid visibility. They limit engagement. They hold resources outside official systems whenever possible. Hoarding becomes rational. Informal exchange becomes safer than formal participation. This is not greed. It is self-preservation. History reveals that once fear becomes the primary economic motivator, cooperation declines sharply. Trust between strangers evaporates. Communities fragment. Social bonds weaken. Collective projects disappear. The economy, once a shared endeavor, becomes an arena of isolation. Authorities, observing this fragmentation, often respond with intensified enforcement. Surveillance expands. Penalties increase. Compliance is monitored more closely. These measures succeed in maintaining surface order, but at enormous cost. Because fear cannot generate loyalty, it can only suppress resistance. The psychological burden of living under enforced economies is immense. Individuals must constantly calculate risk, conceal intent, and navigate unpredictable rules. Over time, this erodes mental resilience. People stop planning for the future because the future feels inaccessible. This loss of future orientation is critical. Civilizations survive hardship when they can imagine improvement. When that imagination disappears, endurance turns into stagnation, and stagnation turns into decay. Historical examples demonstrate this clearly. In late-stage economies, innovation collapses. Not because knowledge is lost, but because applying it becomes dangerous. Creativity requires risk. Risk becomes unacceptable when punishment outweighs reward. Education loses value. Skills atrophy. Knowledge becomes ornamental rather than practical. The economy stops evolving. At this stage, money becomes irrelevant. Not useless, irrelevant. It still exists, but it no longer shapes meaningful choices. People measure value differently now: safety, proximity, protection, loyalty. Economic rationality shifts from optimization to avoidance. The official economy continues to function, but it no longer represents real life. This split produces a society living in two worlds, one governed by law, one governed by necessity. The gap between them widens until they can no longer reconcile. History shows that once this gap reaches a certain size, collapse becomes inevitable. Not because systems fail, but because they are no longer believed. Belief is the final foundation of any economy. When belief disappears, no reform can restore it quickly. No authority can decree it into existence. Trust, once broken, requires time, rupture, and often generational change to rebuild. This is why civilizations at this stage rarely recover smoothly. Recovery would require admitting failure, redistributing power, restoring fairness, and redefining legitimacy. These actions threaten those who benefit from control. As a result, they are postponed indefinitely. Delay replaces decision. Delay accelerates collapse. The end, when it comes, often surprises contemporaries. Systems that appeared stable disintegrate rapidly. Compliance evaporates. Participation collapses. Authority fragments. But historians know the truth. The collapse did not happen suddenly. It happened long before, when money stopped meaning what people needed it to mean, when effort stopped promising dignity, when obedience stopped guaranteeing security, when survival replaced hope. At that moment, the economy ceased to function as a social contract. What followed was only consequence. This is the tragedy revealed by economic history again and again. Civilizations do not fall because they lack resources. They fall because they exhaust meaning. When systems no longer speak for the people who sustain them, those systems become hollow. Money, once the language of cooperation, becomes noise. Numbers continue to move. Accounts remain active. Markets appear alive. But life has already withdrawn. The point of no return is not marked by crisis. It is marked by silence. Silence in planning. Silence in ambition. Silence in belief. Once a society reaches this silence, collapse is no longer a question of if, only of when. In the final chapter, we will confront what happens after this moment. Not the mechanics of collapse, but its aftermath. How societies rebuild meaning after it has been lost, and why history suggests that recovery, when it comes, never restores what existed before. It creates something entirely new. When money loses its meaning, collapse is not the end of the story. It is the clearing. History often portrays collapse as failure, a sudden descent into chaos, poverty, or darkness. But economic history tells a more complex, more uncomfortable truth. Collapse is not merely destruction, it is exposure. It reveals what was already broken long before systems fell apart. What collapses is not currency. What collapses is agreement. Once the invisible agreement dissolves, societies are forced to confront a reality they have avoided for generations. The economy they lived within no longer represented them. It no longer protected effort, rewarded contribution, or justified obedience. In this moment, something fundamental shifts. People stop asking how to restore the old system. They start asking how to survive without it. This distinction matters. History shows that after economic meaning collapses, societies do not immediately rebuild new systems. They enter a period of uncertainty that can last decades or even centuries. During this time, structures fragment, authority decentralizes, life becomes smaller, slower, and more local. This phase is often remembered as decline. In reality, it is recalibration. Without centralized trust, communities reorganize around proximity and necessity. Exchange becomes personal. Value becomes contextual. Relationships replace institutions. The economy shrinks, not because resources vanish, but because abstraction becomes intolerable. People no longer trust distant promises. They trust what they can see, store, defend, and understand. This shift produces societies that look simpler from the outside, but are often more honest internally. Power is less hidden. Inequality is more visible. Exploitation is harder to disguise behind numbers. But this honesty comes at a cost. Large-scale cooperation becomes difficult. Infrastructure decays. Knowledge transmission slows. Complexity is sacrificed for stability. Civilizations lose capabilities they once took for granted. History records this pattern repeatedly. After major economic collapses, literacy declines. Trade networks contract. Specialized professions disappear. The world becomes quieter, narrower, more constrained. This is not regression by ignorance. It is regression by necessity. When survival dominates, complexity becomes dangerous. Yet within this contraction lies the seed of renewal. Economic history reveals that no society rebuilds by restoring what existed before. Attempts to resurrect old systems almost always fail. The conditions that sustained them no longer exist. The trust that supported them is gone. Recovery begins only when new meaning emerges. Meaning does not come from currency reform or institutional design alone. It comes from legitimacy, from fairness, from the perception that participation once again connects effort to dignity. This process is slow. It often takes generations. Those who lived through collapse rarely experience renewal themselves. They adapt, endure, and carry memory. Their children inherit caution. Their grandchildren inherit possibility. This generational rhythm is one of the most consistent patterns in economic history. Civilizations rebuild not by fixing money, but by redefining what money represents. New systems emerge that reflect different priorities: reduced concentration of power, renewed social contracts, altered definitions of wealth. Sometimes these systems are more equitable, sometimes they are not, but they are always different. What never returns is innocence. Once a society has experienced the collapse of meaning, it does not trust abstraction easily again. Skepticism becomes cultural memory. Compliance becomes conditional. Participation becomes negotiated. This memory is often mistaken for cynicism. It is wisdom. History shows that societies which survive collapse and rebuild meaning do so with a deeper understanding of fragility. They design systems with safeguards born of pain. They limit excess not through morality, but through memory. Yet even these systems are temporary, because no economic structure is permanent. Every system, no matter how stable it appears, depends on belief. And belief is not inherited automatically. It must be earned, maintained, and renewed. This is the final lesson of economic history. Money does not fail because it is flawed. It fails because it is trusted beyond its limits. When societies forget that money is an agreement, not a truth, not a law of nature, not a moral authority, they surrender their agency to it. They allow abstraction to replace accountability. Collapse restores that accountability. It reminds humanity that value is human-made, that systems exist to serve life, not the reverse, that economies are tools, not destinies. The unanswered question is not whether collapse will happen again. It will. The question is whether societies will recognize the signs earlier, whether they will protect meaning before it erodes, trust before it fractures, and people before systems consume them. History does not answer this question. It only echoes it. And in those echoes, the past continues to speak, not as warning alone, but as invitation. An invitation to remember that no economy survives without belief, and no belief survives without meaning. History does not always answer. Sometimes it only echoes, and it is within those echoes that the unanswered past continues to speak.